Number 1, Andrei Chikatilo. In the vast, frozen expanse of the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 80s, there existed a dangerous delusion. It was a lie repeated in the halls of the Kremlin and whispered in the police stations of Rostov-on-Don: there is no crime in paradise. The official ideology of the Communist Party declared that serial killing was a uniquely capitalist disease, a symptom of Western decadence and moral decay that could not exist within the socialist utopia. This denial was not just propaganda, it was policy. It blinded investigators, silenced journalists, and created a veil of ignorance across the nation. But while the state was busy denying the existence of monsters, a very real, very human monster was moving unnoticed through the cracks of this crumbling empire. He was a man who looked like nobody. A grandfather. A loyal party member. A mediocre supply clerk with a cheap briefcase and a shuffling walk. His name was Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. And for 12 bloody years, he exploited the system's arrogance to perpetrate the most savage killing spree in Russian history. He did not just kill, he butchered. He hunted the most vulnerable souls of the Soviet state, runaways, dreamers, and children, leaving behind 52 mangled bodies in the birch forests and shelter belts that lined the railways. This is the anatomy of the Red Ripper, and the colossal failure of justice that allowed him to paint the Russian winter red. To understand the butchery, one must first understand the butcher. Andrei Chikatilo was born in 1936 in Ukraine, a land gripped by the throat of Stalin's forced collectivization. He was a child of the Holodomor, the great famine that turned fertile villages into graveyards. His earliest memory was not of love, but of hunger, a gnawing, desperate starvation that reduced humanity to its most primal state. His mother, a woman hardened by survival, told him a story that would fracture his psyche forever. She whispered that during the famine, his older brother, Stepan, had been kidnapped by starving neighbors and eaten. Whether this was truth or a terrified mother's folklore remains unknown, but for young Andrei, the world became a place where humans were not people, but meat. He grew up as a pariah. He was a bedwetter, mocked by his mother and beaten by his father, who had been captured by the Nazis during World War II and returned only to be branded a traitor by the Soviet regime. Chikatilo was weak, socially awkward, and impotent. As he entered puberty, he discovered a humiliating truth: he could not perform sexually. The normal intimacy that connected men and women was a locked door to him. But in this darkness, he found a twisted key. He realized that while he could not make love, he could feel power. He discovered that the sight of fear, the act of domination, and eventually, the spilling of blood, could give him the sexual release that nature had denied him. It was a wiring error in the soul, a short circuit where violence and pleasure became indistinguishable. The beast fully awakened on December 22, 1978. The victim was 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova. Chikatilo, then a 42-year-old married father, lured the young girl into a small wooden house he had bought in Shakhty. His intent was sexual assault, but when his body failed him, his rage took over. In a frenzy of frustration, he stabbed her, strangled her, and threw her small body into the Grichenka River. This murder should have been his end. He was a suspect. Police found blood spots in the snow near his shack. They even brought him in for questioning. But Chikatilo was a member of the party. He was a family man. He didn't fit the profile of a hooligan. Instead, the Soviet police turned their gaze toward a convenient scapegoat, Alexander Kravchenko, a local man with a prior conviction for a murder committed when he was a minor. The interrogation of Kravchenko was a masterclass in brutality. Police beat him, tortured him, and coerced a confession for a crime he did not commit. Despite having an alibi, despite the lack of physical evidence, the system needed a solution, not the truth. Alexander Kravchenko was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in 1983. An innocent man died so that the state could close a file. Meanwhile, Andrei Chikatilo, emboldened by his escape and the incompetence of the authorities, realized he was invisible. The execution of Kravchenko was not justice, it was a permission slip for Chikatilo to begin his slaughter in earnest. Throughout the 1980s, as the Soviet Union began its slow collapse, Chikatilo became a phantom of the railways. His job as a supply clerk required him to travel extensively, giving him a perfect cover. He roamed the train stations and bus terminals of Rostov, Tashkent, and beyond. He looked for the lost ones, young women traveling alone, boys running away from orphanages, people with cheap clothes and hungry eyes. His approach was disarmingly gentle. He was not a predator who dragged victims screaming into a van. He was the kind uncle, the helpful grandfather. He would approach a shivering child with a promise of chewing gum, a tangerine, or a video screening. He would offer a young woman a shortcut through the woods or a promise of easy money. He exploited the poverty of the era. Once he lured them into the shelter belts, the thick rows of trees planted to protect crops from the wind, the transformation was instantaneous. He carried a satchel containing a knife, Vaseline, and lengths of rope. The violence that followed was distinct and horrific. Because of his impotence, Chikatilo did not rape in the traditional sense. He mutilated. He targeted the eyes, gouging them out because, as he later claimed, the eyes preserved the image of the killer. He bit off tongues, nipples, and noses. He disemboweled his victims with surgical savagery. It was in these moments of absolute carnage, as life left the victim's body, that Chikatilo would finally achieve sexual climax. He would leave the bodies in the woods, covered with branches and leaves, and then simply walk back to the train station. He would wash the blood from his hands in the station bathroom, straighten his tie, and board the next train home to his wife, Feodosia, who cooked him dinner, oblivious to the fact that she was sleeping next to the devil. By the mid-80s, the body count was rising so fast that even the Soviet government could no longer deny it. The shelter belt killer became a whispered legend. In Moscow, authorities finally authorized a massive manhunt, codenamed Operation Forest Strip. It was one of the largest police operations in history. Helicopters scoured the tree lines, thousands of officers were deployed to patrol the railway stations. Leading the hunt was Isa Kostoyev, a brilliant and relentless investigator who realized he was chasing a ghost. But the investigation was sabotaged by bad science. In 1984, Chikatilo was actually arrested. He had been spotted acting suspiciously at a bus stop in Rostov. In his briefcase, police found a rope, a knife, and a jar of Vaseline. It seemed like the end. However, the forensic analysis of the time operated on a flawed understanding of biology. Semen samples found on the victims belonged to a person with blood type AB. When they tested Chikatilo's blood, he was type A. The scientists concluded he could not be the killer. They did not know about non-secretors, rare individuals whose bodily fluids like saliva and semen have a different blood type marker than their blood. Because of this scientific blind spot, the most dangerous man in Russia was released. He walked out of the police station, free to kill for another 6 years. During this extra time granted by incompetence, he murdered more than 20 additional people. The year is 1990. The Soviet Union is dissolving. The Berlin Wall has fallen. And in Rostov, Inspector Kostoyev is desperate. He decides to change tactics. Instead of waiting for bodies to be found, he floods the specific train stations where the killer operates with undercover officers in civilian clothes. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo made a mistake. He murdered 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik in the Donlaskaz woods. As he emerged from the tree line, looking disheveled, he was stopped by a patrol officer named Igor Rybakov. Rybakov checked his ID, noted his name, and let him go. There was no evidence of a crime yet. But days later, when Svetlana's body was found, Rybakov remembered the man with the strange eyes coming out of the woods. The name Andrei Chikatilo surfaced in the files again. Kostoyev checked the records and realized this man had been arrested in 1984. The pieces clicked. This time, they didn't just arrest him, they watched him. They saw him approach young boys at the station, attempting to lure them. On November 20, 1990, police surrounded him. As they handcuffed him, they found he had a broken finger, a fresh injury. It was a bite mark from his latest victim, Svetlana, a final testament from the dead that pointed to her killer. Capturing Chikatilo was one thing, proving his guilt was another. There was no DNA technology in Russia at the time. The blood type evidence was still contradictory. Kostoyev needed a confession, but Chikatilo sat in the interrogation room for days, silent, mocking, and playing the role of the confused grandfather. He sang the communist anthem. He ranted about politics. He refused to talk about the bodies. Kostoyev played his final card. He brought in Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky, a psychiatrist who had spent years compiling a psychological profile of the killer, known as Citizen X. Buchanovsky sat across from Chikatilo and began to read the profile aloud. It was a scene of psychological warfare. Buchanovsky described the killer not as a criminal, but as a sick man, a victim of his own biology. He spoke of the killer's impotence, his bedwetting, his shame, his need for control. As Chikatilo listened, his mask began to crumble. For the first time in his life, someone understood him. He wasn't being shouted at, he was being analyzed. The monster felt seen. Tears began to roll down Chikatilo's cheeks. He looked at Buchanovsky and whispered, "I am that person." Over the next few weeks, Chikatilo confessed to 56 murders. He took investigators to the crime scenes, using a plastic mannequin to demonstrate how he mutilated the bodies. Number 2, Jack the Ripper. He is the ghost that haunts the cobblestones of history, a phantom silhouette in a top hat and a cape, vanishing into the yellow fog of Victorian London. He is the original boogeyman of the modern age, the first serial killer to conduct his slaughter under the glare of the international press. While other killers on this list are defined by their capture and confession, this monster is defined by his absence. He was never caught. He was never named. And because of that, he has achieved a twisted kind of immortality. To this day, the mere mention of the year 1888 evokes a specific kind of dread. It brings to mind the gas-lit alleys of Whitechapel, the desperate women of the East End, and the surgical precision of the man who hunted them. This is the story of the Autumn of Terror, and the unknown butcher we call Jack the Ripper. To understand the crimes, one must first descend into the hell that was Whitechapel in the late 19th century. It was not the London of palaces and tea parties, it was a festering wound on the side of the British Empire. Overcrowded, poverty-stricken, and drowning in smog, the East End was a place where hope went to die. Thousands of people lived in squalid, common lodging houses, paying 4 pence for a dirty bed or 2 pence to sleep leaning against a rope. In this desperate ecosystem, women had few choices. Many turned to casual prostitution not out of desire, but out of a simple, crushing need to buy a loaf of bread or a glass of gin to numb the cold. These were the unfortunates, women battered by life, forced to walk the dark, labyrinthine streets at all hours. They were the perfect prey for a predator who knew how to blend into the shadows. The horror began on August 31, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, known to her friends as Polly, was found lying in Bucks Row at 3:40 in the morning. At first glance, the carman who found her thought she might be drunk or asleep. But when his lantern cut through the gloom, the reality was stark. Her throat had been slashed so violently that her head was nearly severed from her body. Her abdomen had been ripped open with a jagged knife. The violence was excessive, far beyond what was necessary to kill. It was an act of rage and curiosity. The police were baffled. Murders in Whitechapel were common, usually the result of drunken brawls or domestic violence, but this was different. This was calculated mutilation. Just over a week later, on September 8, the monster struck again. Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street. The brutality had escalated. Her throat was cut, and her abdomen was completely laid open. But this time, the killer had taken a trophy. The post-mortem examination revealed that her uterus had been surgically removed and taken from the scene. The police surgeon, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, noted that the removal was done with such precision that it would have taken a skilled surgeon nearly an hour to perform, yet the killer had done it in the dark, in a matter of minutes. This detail birthed the theory that would haunt the investigation: the killer was a man of medicine, a doctor, or a butcher, someone who knew the human anatomy intimately. Panic began to grip London. The newspapers, sensing a sensational story, whipped the public into a frenzy. Vigilante groups formed, patrolling the streets with heavy boots and suspicious eyes, beating up anyone who looked like an outsider. But the killer was undeterred. In fact, he seemed to be mocking them. On September 27, the Central News Agency received a letter written in red ink. The author boasted of his crimes, laughing at the police's attempts to catch him. He promised to clip the lady's ears off in his next attack. He signed the letter with a flourish that gave the phantom a name: Jack the Ripper. Whether the letter was genuine or a hoax by a journalist remains a subject of debate, but the name stuck. It gave the public a villain to fear. The terror reached its peak on the night of September 30th, the date known as the double event. That night, the Ripper killed twice. The first victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found in Dutfield's yard. Her throat was cut, but her body was otherwise unmutilated. Investigators believe the killer was interrupted by a horse and cart entering the yard, forcing him to flee before he could finish his grisly work. Frustrated and unsatisfied, he disappeared back into the night to find another victim. Less than an hour later, in Mitre Square, he found Catherine Eddowes. This time, there was no interruption. He unleashed a fury of violence, mutilating her face and removing her left kidney and part of her womb. As he fled, he left a chilling clue: a piece of Eddowes' blood-stained apron was found in a nearby doorway, beneath a message chalked on the wall: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The cryptic graffiti was washed away by order of the police chief to prevent anti-Semitic riots, destroying what might have been a crucial piece of evidence. The psychological warfare continued. On October 16, George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small wooden box. Inside was half of a human kidney, preserved in wine. The accompanying letter was not written in the taunting, educated tone of the Jack the Ripper letter. It was rough, misspelled, and horrifyingly direct. It read, "From hell, Mr. Lusk. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice." The "From Hell" letter remains one of the most chilling artifacts in criminal history, a glimpse into a mind that viewed cannibalism and mutilation as a casual game. The climax of the series came on November 9, 1888. Until this point, the Ripper had operated on the streets, constrained by the fear of discovery and the darkness. But with Mary Jane Kelly, he had time and privacy. Kelly was young, beautiful, and lived in a small room at 13 Miller's Court. The killer went home with her. Once the door was locked, he spent hours dismantling her. When the landlord's assistant looked through the broken window the next morning, he vomited. The room resembled a slaughterhouse. Mary Jane Kelly had been skinned, her organs removed and arranged around the bed like trophies, her face hacked beyond recognition. It was an explosion of psychopathy, the ultimate expression of the Ripper's dark artistry. And then, silence. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the killings stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The police investigated dozens of suspects. There was Montague John Drutt, a troubled barrister who committed suicide in the Thames shortly after the final murder. There was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber with severe mental illness who was institutionalized. There was Michael Ostrog, a Russian conman and thief. Some theories even pointed to the highest echelons of society, implicating the Queen's physician, Sir William Gull, or her grandson, Prince Albert Victor, in a grand Masonic conspiracy. But no charges were ever brought. The fog lifted, but the man in the top hat was gone. The legacy of Jack the Ripper is not just in the 5 women he killed, but in the way he changed the world. He exposed the squalid conditions of the East End, forcing social reforms that eventually cleared the slums. He birthed the modern era of forensics and criminal profiling, as police realized that catching a motiveless killer required more than just witnesses. But most of all, he created a permanent scar on our culture. He reminds us that the city is a place of strangers, and that a monster can walk among us, invisible, hidden by a mask of normalcy. Over a century later, we are still looking over our shoulders, still analyzing the letters, still wondering who he was. But the answer lies buried in the past, rotting beneath the London clay, leaving us only with the legend of the knife, the fog, and the name that will never die. Number 3, Fritz Haarmann. If Jack the Ripper was the phantom of the Victorian fog, Fritz Haarmann was the monster of the daylight, a predator who thrived not in the shadows, but in the chaos of a collapsing society. To understand the magnitude of his crimes, we must first look at the world that created him. Germany in the early 1920s was a nation on its knees. Defeated in the Great War, stripped of its dignity by the Treaty of Versailles, and crippled by hyperinflation so severe that a wheelbarrow of cash could barely buy a loaf of bread, the country was a living hell. In the industrial city of Hanover, the streets were filled with the desperate, war widows, disabled veterans, and thousands of runaway boys drifting from town to town looking for work or food. It was a time of absolute moral disintegration, where survival was the only law. And in this ecosystem of misery, Fritz Haarmann opened a shop. To the locals and the working-class district of the old town, Haarmann was a character. He was known as Uncle Fritz, a dapper, chatty man who always seemed to have meat, clothes, and tobacco to sell, even when the shops were empty. He was a black marketeer, a smuggler, and most terrifyingly, a police informant. The local detectives relied on Haarmann to tip them off about thieves and fences. He carried a badge, or at least he acted like he did, patrolling the train station with an air of authority. This relationship with the law was his ultimate shield. The police visited his apartment not to investigate him, but to pick up information and, occasionally, to buy cheap meat from him. They never asked where the meat came from. They never asked about the strange, sweet smell that sometimes drifted from his room. Haarmann's hunting ground was the Hanover Central Station. It was a hive of lost souls, a place where young boys arrived from the countryside with empty stomachs and no place to sleep. Haarmann would approach them with a grandfatherly smile. He would offer them a warm meal, a bed for the night, and perhaps a job. For a starving teenager in 1923, this offer was a lifeline. They would follow him back to his attic apartment at 27 Cellar Street, believing they had found a savior. They did not know they were walking into a slaughterhouse. Once the door was locked, the vampire of Hanover emerged. Haarmann's method of killing was primal and deeply sexual. He did not use a gun or a rope. He used his teeth. In a frenzy of violence, he would bite through the victim's throat, tearing out the trachea. He drank their blood as they died, fulfilling a vampiric fantasy that fused murder with sexual ecstasy. The violence was often witnessed or assisted by his young lover and accomplice, Hans Granz, a parasitic figure who manipulated Haarmann and profited from the clothes and belongings of the dead boys. But the horror did not end with the murder. What happened next is what cements Fritz Haarmann as one of the most evil men in European history. Haarmann was a butcher by nature. He would drag the bodies into the bathroom and dismantle them with the efficiency of an assembly line worker. He stripped the flesh from the bones, bucket by bucket. The clothes of the victims were cleaned and sold in his second-hand shop. And the meat? This is the detail that still haunts the city of Hanover a century later. Persistent rumors, supported by neighbor testimony and the sheer volume of pork Haarmann sold during a famine, suggest that he sold the flesh of his victims to his neighbors and local restaurants. In a starving city, people didn't ask questions about cheap sausages. The police themselves, who frequented his home, may have unknowingly consumed the very people they were supposed to be searching for. For years, parents in Hanover reported their sons missing. The police dismissed the reports, assuming the boys had simply run away to Berlin or Hamburg to find work. They refused to suspect their star informant, Uncle Fritz. On one occasion, a frantic mother even tracked her son to Haarmann's apartment. The police raided the room, but Haarmann played it cool. There was a boy hiding in the apartment, but he was too terrified to speak. The police apologized to Haarmann for the intrusion and left. The boy was never seen again. It was a failure of duty so profound that it borders on complicity. The truth finally began to surface in May of 1924. Children playing by the banks of the Lane River, which ran through the city, made a gruesome discovery. They found a human skull. Then another. And another. The river, bloated with the secrets Haarmann had dumped there, was finally giving up the dead. When police dredged the riverbed, they found hundreds of bones, skulls, femurs, pelvises. They had been stripped clean of meat, cut with knife marks that indicated a professional hand. The sheer number of remains indicated a massacre of industrial scale. The investigation inevitably led back to the man who lived near the river and dealt in meat. Fritz Haarmann was arrested in June of 1924. Under interrogation, he was surprisingly candid. He treated the detectives like old colleagues, chatting casually about his methods. He confessed to killing at least 24 boys, though the bone count suggested the number was likely between 50 and 70. He denied selling the meat, perhaps the only shame he felt, but he admitted to the biting, the dismembering, and the disposal. He spoke of the killings as if they were episodes of a trance, claiming he loved the boys he killed, that he was sending them to a better place. The trial was a media sensation, dubbed the trial of the century, in Germany. Haarmann sat in the dock, often interrupting the judge, smoking cigars, and making jokes. He showed no remorse, only a strange, detached curiosity about the proceedings. He was examined by the leading psychiatrists of the era, who declared him sane enough to stand trial, though deeply psychopathic. The court found him guilty of 24 counts of murder. When the death sentence was read, Haarmann accepted it with a shrug. He had only one request, that his execution be swift. On the morning of April 15, 1925, Fritz Haarmann was led to the courtyard of Hanover prison. In accordance with German law at the time, he was not hanged, he was beheaded by guillotine. As he laid his head on the block, he reportedly said, "I repent, but I do not fear death." The blade fell, ending the life of the vampire of Hanover. But his story did not end with his death. His head was preserved in a jar of formalin and kept at the University of Göttingen for medical students to study. It remained there for nearly 90 years, a macabre artifact staring out from the shelf, until it was finally cremated in 2014. Fritz Haarmann remains a terrifying symbol of the Weimar Republic's dark heart, a reminder that when a society collapses into poverty and chaos, the monsters don't just come out of the dark, they open shop, and they sell us our own destruction. Number 4, Peter Kurten. While Fritz Haarmann was butchering boys in the shadows of Hanover, another, perhaps even more sophisticated monster was waking up just a few hours away in the wealthy, industrial city of Düsseldorf. If Haarmann was a scavenger, feeding on the desperate, this man was a hunter who sought to terrorize the entire population. He was a dandy, a man who wore expensive suits, powdered his face, and frequented the opera. To his neighbors, he was a polite, quiet factory worker. But to history, he is known as the Vampire of Düsseldorf. His name was Peter Kurten, and his crimes were so random, so brutal, and so varied that for months, the police believed they were hunting a dozen different maniacs, not just one. The year was 1929. Düsseldorf was a city of culture and industry, a stark contrast to the poverty of other German regions. But in February of that year, a darkness descended that would turn the city into a ghost town after sunset. It began with a series of brutal, inexplicable attacks. Unlike most serial killers who have a specific type, prostitutes, children, or the elderly, Kurten had no type. He attacked men, women, and children indiscriminately. He used knives, daggers, hammers, and scissors. He strangled, stabbed, and bludgeoned. This absolute lack of a pattern was his greatest weapon. It created a psychological siege where no one felt safe. A burly steelworker walking home was just as likely to be attacked as a young girl playing in the park. Kurten didn't just want to kill, he wanted to play God with the city's fear. To understand the depth of his sadism, we must look at his origins. Kurten was born into a house of horrors in Cologne. His father was a violent alcoholic who would force his wife to have sex in front of the children and beat them mercilessly. Kurten learned early that violence was the language of power. As a young boy, he worked for a dog catcher, where he discovered a disturbing thrill in torturing and killing the stray animals. He later admitted to stabbing sheep in the fields just to watch them die. This escalation from animals to humans is a classic textbook progression of a psychopath, but Kurten added a layer of sexual perversion that baffled the psychiatrists of the time. He claimed that the sight of blood gave him a sexual orgasm. The more blood, the greater the release. His reign of terror in 1929 was a crescendo of violence. In August alone, he committed a string of attacks that pushed the city to the brink of madness. He stabbed a man, attacked a young woman with a hammer, and murdered 2 children, all within days of each other. He murdered a 9-year-old girl named Rosa Oliger, stabbing her 13 times and setting her body on fire with kerosene in an attempt to destroy the evidence. He strangled a servant girl named Maria Hahn and buried her in a shallow grave in the countryside. The ferocity was unmatched. In one instance, he stabbed a mechanic 20 times in the temple with a screwdriver simply because the man looked at him the wrong way. But the moniker, vampire, came from a specific, chilling detail. In several attacks, most notably the murder of a swan in the Hofgarten Park which he killed as a prelude to human slaughter, and later with human victims, Kurten attempted to drink the blood flowing from the wounds. He told psychiatrists that the salty taste of blood was the only thing that could quench his thirst. He described reaching a state of ecstasy when he swallowed the life force of his victims. Whether this was a literal compulsion or a theatrical embellishment to horrify his captors is debated, but the effect was the same. He became a creature of folklore, a monster that parents used to frighten their children into obedience. The police response was unprecedented. Over 13,000 letters of accusation were sent to the station by terrified citizens turning on their neighbors. The police interviewed 900,000 people, nearly the entire population of the region. But Kurten slipped through every net. He was too normal. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a gentleman. He even returned to the scenes of his crimes to watch the police work, deriving a sick pleasure from their confusion. He would stand in the crowd, listening to the theories of the onlookers, smiling internally at his own cleverness. He even sent a map to a local communist newspaper, mocking the police and revealing the location of Maria Hahn's body, just to prove he was in control. His downfall, however, came from a moment of hesitation. In May of 1930, Kurten accosted a young woman named Maria Budlik at the train station. He brought her to his apartment, gave her milk and a sandwich, and then led her into the Grafenberg woods. He began to strangle her, but for some reason, perhaps her calmness, or perhaps he had simply lost the mood, he stopped. He let her go. He even showed her the way back to the tram stop. It was a fatal error. Maria Budlik remembered the location of his apartment. She led the police straight to the door of the polite man who had tried to kill her. When the police began to close in, Kurten did something that revealed the twisted pragmatism of his mind. He knew he was caught. He knew the dragnet was tightening. So, he went to his wife. She was completely unaware of his double life. To her, he was a loving, if somewhat strange, husband. He confessed everything to her over dinner. He told her he was the vampire of Dusseldorf. And then, he made a proposal. There was a massive cash reward for his capture. He told his wife to go to the police and denounce him, so that she could collect the reward money and live comfortably after he was gone. It was a final, bizarre act of distorted love, or perhaps just another way to control the narrative of his own end. On May 24, 1930, Peter Kurten was arrested. He did not fight. He confessed to 68 crimes, including 9 murders and 31 attempted murders. He described his crimes with the cool detachment of a surgeon, recounting details that made even the seasoned detectives vomit. He admitted that during his prison stints in his youth, he would fantasize about blowing up the entire city or poisoning the water supply to kill everyone at once. He was not just a murderer, he was a misanthrope who hated humanity itself. The trial in 1931 was a spectacle. Kurten arrived in court well-dressed, combing his hair and bowing to the jury. He seemed to enjoy the attention, treating the trial as his grand finale. He pleaded insanity, claiming he was driven by forces beyond his control, but the jury saw only a cold-blooded sadist. He was found guilty and sentenced to death 9 times over. On July 2, 1931, Peter Kurten was led to the guillotine in Cologne prison. Even facing death, his obsession with blood and violence remained his only thought. His final words to the prison psychiatrist are among the most chilling ever recorded. He asked, calmly, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." The blade fell, silencing the vampire of Dusseldorf forever. His head, like Haarmann's, was bisected and studied by scientists who hoped to find a physical deformity in his brain that explained his evil. They found nothing. His brain looked exactly like anyone else's. Peter Kurten remains a terrifying enigma, a man who proved that the scariest monsters aren't the ones who look like beasts, but the ones who wear suits, blend into the crowd, and dream of hearing the world bleed. Number 5, Anatoli Onoprienko. In the mid-1990s, as the former Soviet Union collapsed into a chaotic collection of independent states, a darkness settled over the villages of Ukraine. It was a time of economic ruin, lawlessness, and uncertainty. But for the people living in the remote hamlets of the Zhytomyr and Lviv regions, the real terror was not the economy, it was a sound. It was the sound of breaking glass in the middle of the night, followed by the deafening roar of a sawed-off shotgun. There was no negotiation, no robbery gone wrong, and no mercy. There was only extermination. The man responsible for this nightmare did not hunt for pleasure like Chikatilo or for blood like Haarmann. He hunted like a machine. He wiped out entire bloodlines with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse processor. The press called him the Beast of Ukraine. He called himself the Terminator. His name was Anatoli Onoprienko, and he is the single most prolific mass murderer in modern history, a man who killed 52 people not out of passion, but because he believed he was a robot designed by a higher power to cleanse the earth. To comprehend the sheer nihilism of Onoprienko, one must look at the fracture in his soul that occurred in childhood. Born in 1959, his life was defined by abandonment. His mother died when he was 4. His father, unable or unwilling to care for 2 sons, made a choice that would breed a monster. He kept Anatoli's older brother, but he dumped Anatoli into an orphanage. This singular act of rejection planted a seed of hatred deep within him, a hatred not just for his father, but for the very concept of family. As he grew up in the bleak, institutional coldness of the orphanage, he watched happy families from a distance, and he despised them. He decided that if he could not have a family, he would destroy them. His career in violence began in 1989. Along with an accomplice, Sergei Rogozin, Onoprienko targeted couples sleeping in cars along the highways. They robbed and killed 9 people. It was a brutal spree, but it ended abruptly when Onoprienko fled to Europe, drifting through Germany and Austria, trying to outrun his demons. But the demons were patient. In 1995, he returned to Ukraine. He was alone now, and the voice in his head, which he later claimed was the voice of God or extraterrestrials, gave him a new command. The command was simple: kill everyone. The winter of 1995 to 1996 became known as the Winter of Terror. Onoprienko armed himself with a TOZ-34 double-barreled hunting shotgun. He sawed off the stock and the barrel, turning it into a devastating weapon of close-quarters combat that he could hide under his coat. His modus operandi was terrifyingly consistent. He would choose an isolated house on the edge of a village. He would wait until the dead of night. Then, he would shatter a window or kick down the door. The father was always the first target. Onoprienko would blast him with the shotgun to eliminate the primary threat. Then the mother. Then the children. He did not spare the infants. If he ran out of ammunition, he used knives, axes, or hammers found in the house to finish the job. The cruelty was absolute. In one horrific instance, he broke into a house where a family of 4 was sleeping. He shot the parents, but the gun jammed. The 2 young daughters were cowering in the corner. Onoprienko calmly fixed the jam, reloaded, and executed them. He later told police that the children were too beautiful to leave behind in this ugly world. After the slaughter, he would ransack the house, taking mundane items, wedding rings, VCRs, food, old clothes. He wasn't stealing for profit, he was stealing the trophies of the domestic life he was denied. Before leaving, he would set the house on fire, turning the family home into a funeral pyre. The speed of the killings was unprecedented. In the span of just 3 months, from December 1995 to March 1996, he murdered 43 people. He wiped out entire families in a single night. The police were overwhelmed. The newly independent Ukrainian government deployed the National Guard. Tanks and armored vehicles patrolled the snowy roads of the countryside. Over 2,000 investigators worked the case. Panic gripped the nation. People slept with axes by their beds. Villagers formed vigilante groups, terrified that the beast would come for them next. But Onoprienko was a ghost. He traveled by commuter train, blending in with the tired workers, carrying his shotgun in a gym bag, moving from region to stay ahead of the dragnet. His capture, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. In April of 1996, the police received a tip that a strange man was staying at his cousin's house in the town of Yavor. A massive tactical team surrounded the building. When they kicked down the door, they found the most feared man in Ukraine sitting on the floor, listening to music. He reached for a knife, but he was quickly subdued. In his possession, they found a sawed-off shotgun that had ended 52 lives. They also found a collection of jewelry and trinkets stolen from the dead. The interrogation of Anatoli Onoprienko provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a psychopath who had completely detached from humanity. He did not deny the killings. In fact, he claimed responsibility for even more. He spoke with a calm, monotonous voice, describing the massacres as work. He told the detectives, "I did not kill them. I just sent them to heaven." He claimed that he was being controlled by a cosmic energy, and that he was a robot programmed to cull the human herd. He showed zero remorse. When shown photos of the children he had butchered, he looked at them with the indifference of a man looking at a grocery list. He said, "I felt nothing. No pity, no anger. Just the need to finish the job." The trial in 1999 was a national event. Onoprienko sat in a metal cage, much like Chikatilo, staring blankly at the screaming relatives of his victims. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of 52 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to death. However, history intervened. Ukraine had just joined the Council of Europe, and as a condition of membership, the country had placed a moratorium on capital punishment. The beast of Ukraine could not be executed. This sparked outrage across the country. President Leonid Kuchma even appealed to the international community, asking for an exception to execute Onoprienko, stating that no human law applies to a beast like this. The request was denied. Anatoli Onoprienko's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was sent to the notorious Zhytomyr prison, the very region where he had committed his worst atrocities. He spent the next 14 years in solitary confinement, a man alone in a concrete box, cut off from the world he had tried to destroy. He reportedly spent his time reading and complaining about the prison food, utterly unaffected by the ocean of grief he had created. On August 27, 2013, Anatoli Onoprienko collapsed in his cell and died of heart failure at the age of 54. The Terminator was finally deactivated. His death brought a quiet end to the bloodiest chapter in Ukrainian criminal history. But the scars remain. In the villages of Zhytomyr, there are still burnt-out ruins of houses where families once lived, standing as silent monuments to the man who waged a war against the very idea of home. Onoprienko remains a terrifying example of what happens when a man loses his soul and replaces it with a mission of absolute destruction. Number 6, Alexander Pichushkin. If Andrei Chikatilo was the nightmare of the Soviet past, Alexander Pichushkin is the monster of the Russian present. While Chikatilo claimed he killed out of sexual impotence and confusion, Pichushkin killed for a reason that is perhaps even more chilling: ambition. He viewed murder as a sport, a competitive endeavor where human lives were merely points on a scoreboard. He is known to the world as the chessboard killer, a name derived from his gruesome goal: to kill 64 people, one for every square on a chessboard. But his true motivation was even darker. He was obsessed with the legacy of the Red Ripper. He didn't just want to be like Chikatilo, he wanted to be better than him. He wanted to beat Chikatilo's record of 52 victims and claim the title of Russia's most prolific serial killer. To the residents of southwest Moscow, the sprawling Bitsa Park was a sanctuary, a vast forest in the middle of the concrete city where people walked their dogs, played chess, and drank vodka under the birch trees. But in the early 2000s, Bitsa Park became a graveyard. Alexander Pichushkin, a quiet, muscular grocery store clerk who worked at a supermarket on the edge of the park, treated this forest as his personal hunting ground. To his co-workers, he was a bit strange but harmless. To his victims, he was a friendly face offering a drink. But beneath the surface, Pichushkin was a ticking bomb, wired for violence by a childhood trauma. As a young boy, he fell backwards off a swing, suffering a severe head injury that damaged his frontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls impulse and empathy. Coupled with relentless bullying at school, this injury created a personality that was cold, aggressive, and devoid of fear. Pichushkin committed his first murder in 1992, at the age of 18. It was the same year Chikatilo was on trial, and the young Pichushkin was watching closely. He strangled a classmate and threw him out of a window, framing it as a suicide. The police fell for it. Emboldened by this success, he waited. For nearly a decade, he simmered, planning his grand game. When he finally unleashed his fury in 2001, it was a calculated campaign of extermination. His methodology was brutally simple and relied on the crushing loneliness of Moscow's underclass. Pichushkin targeted the elderly, the homeless, and the alcoholics, men and women who spent their days in the park, people he believed society would not miss. He would approach a solitary figure with a bottle of vodka. He would tell them a sad story, claiming his dog had just died and he needed someone to share a drink with him to mourn the animal's memory. It was a lie designed to exploit the Russian cultural tradition of communal drinking. Flattered and thirsty, the victim would follow him deep into the secluded woods of Bitsa Park to visit the dog's grave. Once they were deep in the forest and the victim was intoxicated, Pichushkin would strike. He attacked from behind with a hammer, smashing their skulls with ferocious force. But he didn't stop at killing them. He wanted to erase them. Pichushkin had discovered a network of sewage wells scattered throughout the park. After bludgeoning his victims, he would drag them to an open manhole cover and dump them headfirst into the subterranean sewer system. The horror of this disposal method is unspeakable. Forensic evidence later suggested that many victims were still alive when they were thrown into the darkness, eventually drowning in the freezing sewage water or dying from their injuries underground. The sewers washed the bodies away, leaving no evidence, no smell, and no trace for the police. For years, people simply vanished into the earth. Pichushkin kept a track record of his atrocities in his apartment. He had a chessboard. After every murder, he would stick a date on a square. He saw himself as a god deciding who lived and who died. He later said, "For me, a life without murder is like a life without food for you. I felt like the father of all these people, since it was I who opened the door for them to another world." He believed he was granting them a favor, sending them to a better place, while simultaneously filling his chessboard. As his confidence grew, he became sloppy. He stopped targeting just the homeless and began targeting people who knew him. In June of 2006, he invited a co-worker, a woman named Marina Moskolyova, for a walk in the park. Marina was hesitant. Before she left, she wrote a note to her son, "I am going for a walk with Sasha from work," and she left Pichushkin's phone number on the paper. That note would be his undoing. When Marina's body was found in the park, unlike the others, she was not thrown in a sewer. The police found the note. They also recovered CCTV footage from the metro station showing Marina walking alongside Pichushkin just hours before her death. On June 16, 2006, police arrested Alexander Pichushkin at his apartment. He did not deny the crimes. In fact, he was outraged that the police only accused him of 49 murders. He demanded credit for more. He immediately asked for his chessboard to be brought into evidence. He proudly showed investigators that 61 of the 64 squares were filled. He claimed he was just 3 bodies away from completing his game. He told the detectives, "If you had not caught me, I would have never stopped. I would have killed you all." The interrogation tapes of Pichushkin are chilling. He sits calmly, recounting the details of each murder with a smirk. He bragged about the vodka lure, laughing at how easy it was to trick people. He expressed deep admiration for Chikatilo but insisted he had surpassed his idol. "Chikatilo was a child compared to me," he boasted. He wanted the world to know that he was the new king of killers. The trial in 2007 was a circus of arrogance. Pichushkin was placed in a glass cage, the aquarium, for his own protection. He spent the trial pacing like a caged tiger, threatening the judge and mocking the families of the victims. He famously told the court, "I'm not a maniac, I'm just doing my job." The jury took less than 3 hours to convict him. He was found guilty of 48 murders and 3 attempted murders, though he continues to claim the true number is 61 or higher. Because Russia had placed a moratorium on the death penalty in the 90s, Pichushkin was spared the executioner's bullet that ended Chikatilo. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Snowy Owl prison, a harsh penal colony in the Arctic Circle designed for the worst of the worst. Alexander Pichushkin remains there today, a man who treated human life as a game, sitting in a cell with no chessboard, with nothing left to play but the memories of the 61 souls he claims to have checkmated. Number 7, Harold Shipman. In the pantheon of European monsters, there are those who kill with rage, those who kill with lust, and those who kill for greed. But there is a rarer, colder breed of predator who kills simply because he can, because he holds the power of God in his hands. In the quiet, cobblestone market town of Hyde, near Manchester, England, there lived a man who was the pillar of the community. He was the trusted family doctor, the man who delivered babies, comforted the grieving, and held the hands of the dying. His name was Harold Frederick Shipman. To his patients, he was a saint who made house calls and genuinely cared. But beneath the stethoscope and the tweed jacket lived a narcissist of staggering proportions. Harold Shipman was not saving lives, he was ending them. By the time his reign of quiet terror ended, he had murdered an estimated 250 people, making him the most prolific serial killer in the modern history of the world. To understand how a healer becomes a killer, we must look to the trauma of his youth. Born in 1946 in Nottingham, Shipman was a mummy's boy, dominated by his mother, Vera. When he was 17, Vera was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Young Harold watched as the doctor came to their house, took out a syringe, and administered morphine to ease her pain. He watched the way the drug dissolved her agony, how it relaxed her, and how it eventually ushered her into the darkness. He became fascinated by the power of the needle. He saw the doctor not as a servant of medicine, but as an angel of mercy who controlled the threshold between life and death. That image burned into his mind, the quiet room, the syringe, the absolute control. Shipman graduated from medical school in 1970, but his dark side emerged early. In 1975, while working at a medical practice in Todmorden, he was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, an opioid painkiller, to feed his own addiction. He was fined, fired, and forced into drug rehabilitation. In any other profession, or perhaps in a later era, this would have been the end of his career. But the British medical establishment of the 1970s was an old boys' club that protected its own. He was deemed cured, allowed to keep his medical license, and in 1977, he moved to Hyde to start fresh. The system gave him a second chance, and he used it to build a slaughterhouse. For over 20 years, Shipman operated with terrifying impunity. His modus operandi was chillingly consistent. He targeted the elderly, mostly women living alone, people whose deaths would not raise immediate suspicion. He would arrive at their homes unannounced, claiming he was just checking in. He would sit them down in their favorite armchair, perhaps offer them a cup of tea, and then suggest they needed a booster shot or a blood test. Trusting him implicitly, they would roll up their sleeves. Shipman would then inject them with a lethal dose of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin. He would sit with them as their lungs stopped working, watching the life drain from their eyes with a clinical, detached fascination. But the murder was only the first act. The second act was the cover-up. Shipman would rearrange the scene to make it look like a natural death. He would prop them up in a peaceful pose. Then, he would call the family and the undertaker, playing the role of the grieving doctor. "I'm so sorry," he would say, "her heart just gave out." Because he was a doctor, he could sign the death certificates himself. He listed causes like coronary thrombosis or old age. He even urged families to cremate the bodies quickly, destroying the evidence of the poison. He was the killer, the coroner, and the grief counselor all in one. His arrogance was his shield, but it was also his downfall. He believed he was intellectually superior to everyone around him. He didn't kill for money, at least not initially, he killed for the thrill of control. However, as the years went on, he became sloppy and greedy. In June of 1998, he murdered Kathleen Grundy, the 81-year-old former mayor of Hyde. Mrs. Grundy was a wealthy, vibrant woman with a sharp mind. Her death shocked her daughter, Angela Woodruff, a lawyer. The mistake Shipman made was monumental. After killing Mrs. Grundy, he forged her will. The new will, clumsily typed on an old typewriter, left her entire estate, worth nearly £400,000, to "my doctor, Harold Shipman," and explicitly cut out her children. It was a crude, obvious forgery that raised immediate red flags for Angela Woodruff. She knew her mother was meticulous and would never sign such a poorly written document. She went to the police. When detectives exhumed Kathleen Grundy's body, the toxicology report was damning. Her tissues were saturated with diamorphine. It wasn't a natural death, it was an execution. This discovery triggered a cascade. Police began to look at Shipman's other patients. They exhumed 14 more bodies. The pattern was identical, lethal doses of morphine in every single one. They also seized Shipman's computer. He had thought he was clever by altering the digital medical records of his victims to create false histories of heart problems. But computer forensics revealed that he had altered the records after the patients had died, sometimes mere minutes after he killed them. The digital trail proved his guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. Shipman was arrested in September of 1998. During his interrogation, he was breathtakingly arrogant. He turned his back on the detectives, closed his eyes, and refused to look at the photos of the women he had murdered. He denied everything, claiming Mrs. Grundy was a drug addict and he was being framed. He treated the police with contempt, convinced he could outsmart them. The trial in nearly 2000 was a national trauma for the United Kingdom. It shattered the sacred trust between doctor and patient. Shipman was convicted of 15 counts of murder, though a subsequent government inquiry, the Shipman Inquiry, concluded that he had likely killed 250 people, starting as early as 1971. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. But Harold Shipman had one final act of control left. He refused to let the state punish him. He refused to give the families the satisfaction of a confession or an apology. On January 13, 2004, on the eve of his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman hanged himself in his cell at Wakefield Prison using his bedsheets. He died as he lived, on his own terms, taking his secrets to the grave. His death robbed the families of answers, but it ensured his place in history as the ultimate angel of death, a man who turned the Hippocratic Oath into a license to kill. Number 8, Marc Dutroux. Belgium is often viewed as the quiet administrative heart of Europe, a land of chocolate, bureaucracy, and medieval town squares. But in the mid-1990s, this small nation stared into an abyss so deep it nearly tore the country apart. The face of that abyss was Marc Dutroux, a man who would become known simply as the Monster of Belgium. His crimes did not involve the high body counts of Chikatilo or the medical perversion of Shipman. Instead, they involved a cruelty so prolonged and claustrophobic that it sounds like the script of a horror movie. Dutroux was a predator who specialized in kidnapping young girls and imprisoning them in a secret dungeon built beneath his house, a subterranean hell where he played the role of a twisted father figure, master, and tormentor. To understand the tragedy, one must first confront the failure of the justice system. Dutroux was not an unknown quantity. In 1989, he was convicted of abducting and raping 5 young girls. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison. But in 1992, in a decision that still haunts the Belgian conscience, he was released on parole after serving only 3 years. The psychiatrists deemed him a low risk. His mother even wrote a letter to the parole board warning them that her son was a psychopath who would strike again. The board ignored her. They released a wolf back into the flock, and he immediately began to build a lair. Dutroux purchased a rundown house in the depressed industrial suburb of Marcinelle, near Charleroi. He was a skilled electrician and handyman, and he used these talents to construct a secret prison. Behind a shelving unit in his basement, he installed a reinforced steel door disguised to look like the wall. Behind that door was a tiny, unventilated cell, barely larger than a closet. It was soundproof, damp, and utterly inescapable. This was the trap he set for the children of Belgium. The nightmare began in June of 1995. 2 8-year-old best friends, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, were playing on a bridge near their homes in Liège. Dutroux, cruising in his white van, snatched them. He brought them to Marcinelle and locked them in the dungeon. For months, the parents of Julie and Melissa pleaded on national television for their return, unaware that their daughters were alive, huddled together in the darkness just a few feet beneath the floor where Dutroux ate his dinner. Then, a twist of fate occurred that turned a kidnapping into a slow-motion tragedy. In December of 1995, Dutroux was arrested, not for kidnapping, but for a car theft ring. He was sent to prison for 3 months. During this time, the police searched his house. They walked through the basement. They stood inches away from the concealed door behind the shelf. They heard nothing. They saw nothing. And they left. Inside the cell, Julie and Melissa were alone. Dutroux, sitting in his jail cell, chose not to tell anyone about the girls. He simply let them starve. By the time he was released from jail and returned home, the 2 8-year-olds had died a slow, agonizing death from starvation and dehydration. He buried them in his backyard. Unfazed by the death of his captives, Dutroux restocked his dungeon. In May of 1996, he kidnapped 2 teenagers, and Marcel and Yves Lambrechts, after a magic show. They, too, were assaulted and eventually murdered, buried under a shed in the garden. He then kidnapped 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne as she rode her bicycle to school. Sabine would survive the longest in the dungeon, 80 days. She was later joined by 14-year-old Laetitia Delhaize. These 2 girls became the only witnesses to the full extent of Dutroux's depravity. He would starve them, terrorize them, and force them to write letters to their parents saying they were fine, all while keeping them locked in the filth of the cellar. The breakthrough finally came in August of 1996, thanks to a sharp-eyed witness. When Laetitia Delhaize was snatched in broad daylight, a student noted the license plate of a suspicious white van. The police traced it to Marc Dutroux. This time, they didn't just knock on the door, they raided the house. Dutroux, realizing the game was up, confessed that he had 2 girls in the basement. When police moved the shelf and opened the steel door, they found Sabine and Laetitia, alive but terrified. The image of the 2 girls emerging from the dungeon, wrapped in blankets and blinking in the sunlight, became the defining image of the decade in Belgium. But the relief of the rescue was quickly replaced by a wave of national grief and fury as the bodies of Julie, Melissa, and Yves were exhumed from the garden. The anger boiled over when it was revealed how many times the police had missed clues. A policeman had visited the house while Julie and Melissa were alive and claimed he heard children's voices, but he didn't report it because he thought it was coming from the street. Another report about Dutroux building a dungeon was lost in administrative paperwork. The scandal triggered the White March in October of 1996. 300,000 Belgians, nearly 3% of the population, marched through Brussels dressed in white, demanding justice and the resignation of the corrupt officials who had failed their children. It was the largest demonstration in Belgian history since the Second World War. The public believed Dutroux was part of a larger pedophile ring protected by high-ranking politicians and police officers. While these conspiracy theories were never fully proven in court, the incompetence of the police was undeniable. The legal process was a marathon. Dutroux tried to escape custody in 1998, managing to overpower a guard and run into the woods, triggering a panic that nearly caused the government to collapse before he was recaptured hours later. Finally, in 2004, 8 years after his arrest, Marc Dutroux faced trial. He sat behind bulletproof glass, staring down the survivors, Sabine and Letitia, who bravely testified against him. He showed no remorse, painting himself as a victim of a larger system. The jury was not swayed. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Marc Dutroux remains in Nivelles prison today, the most hated man in Belgium. He is a solitary figure, isolated from other prisoners who would likely kill him given the chance. His house in Marcinelle, the site of the horror, stood for years as a grim reminder, covered in graffiti and white flowers left by mourners, until it was finally demolished in 2022 to make way for a memorial garden. Dutroux's legacy is a permanent scar on the heart of Europe, a reminder of what happens when a justice system becomes so bureaucratic and complacent that it allows a monster to build a hell in the basement and lock the door. Number 9, Dennis Nilsen. In the late 1970s, London was a city of punk rock, strikes, and social unrest. But for the thousands of young men drifting through the capital, runaways, students, and the unemployed, the biggest danger was not the riots, but the quiet, bespectacled civil servant living in North London. To his colleagues at the job centre, Dennis Nilsen was a boring, talkative man, a former police officer and army cook who droned on about union politics. He was utterly ordinary, a man who blended into the grey background of the city. But behind the closed doors of his flats, first at Melrose Avenue and later at Cranley Gardens, Nilsen was living a nightmare of necrophilia and decay. He is known as the Muswell Hill murderer, but his crimes were not driven by hate or sadism. They were driven by a pathological loneliness so deep that he killed people simply to make them stay. Nilsen's psychology was a tangle of abandonment and isolation. Born in Scotland, he felt like an outsider all his life. He was a man who craved company but struggled to connect with the living. He found that the living were messy, they argued, they judged, and most importantly, they left. The dead, however, were compliant. They were quiet. They stayed where you put them. This twisted logic became the foundation of his killing spree, which lasted from 1978 to 1983 and claimed the lives of at least 12, and possibly as many as 15, young men. His victims were the vulnerable drifters of Soho's gay scene. Nilsen would frequent the pubs, looking for young men who looked hungry or lost. He would offer them a drink, a meal, and a place to sleep. Grateful for the kindness of a stranger, they would go back to his flat. There, they would drink rum and listen to music. When the victim passed out from alcohol or exhaustion, Nilsen would strike. He strangled them, sometimes drowning them in the bathtub or the sink to finish the job. But for Nilsen, the murder was not the climax, it was merely the prelude. What followed the killing is what makes the Nilsen case so uniquely disturbing. He did not dispose of the bodies immediately. He kept them. He washed them, dried them, and dressed them in casual clothes. He would prop them up in armchairs and position them around the room. He would sit with them for days, watching television, talking to them, and sleeping next to them. In his mind, he had created the perfect companion, someone who would never reject him. He lived with the corpses until the process of decomposition made it impossible to keep them any longer. When the smell became too overpowering, the practical side of Nilsen took over. He became a butcher in his own kitchen. He would dissect the bodies on the floorboards. At his first flat on Melrose Avenue, he buried the remains under the floorboards of the living room. For years, he lived above a growing graveyard, masking the smell with air fresheners and open windows. But when he moved to the attic flat at Cranley Gardens in 1981, he lost his garden and his floor space. He had to find a new way to get rid of the evidence. He began to boil the heads and hands on his stove to remove the flesh, crushing the bones with a hammer. The soft tissue, the internal organs, and the smaller pieces of flesh were flushed down the toilet. This gruesome disposal method would be his undoing. In February of 1983, the other tenants in the building at Cranley Gardens began to complain about the plumbing. The toilets were not flushing, the drains were blocked, and a foul, meaty smell was rising from the pipes. The landlord called a plumbing company, Dino Rod, to investigate. When the plumber opened the manhole cover on the side of the house, he didn't find a blockage of paper or waste. He found a slurry of human flesh and small bones clogging the sewer pipe. The plumber reported the finding to his supervisor and the police. When Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. arrived, he waited for Nilsen to return from work. As Nilsen walked up the path, unaware that his secret was lying exposed in the open drain, the detectives approached him. They asked him where the rest of the body was. Nilsen, realizing the game was over, didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply sighed and said, "It's in the cupboard." The search of the flat was a descent into hell. In the wardrobe, police found black trash bags filled with human body parts. In a tea chest, they found 2 torsos. The smell was so intense that seasoned officers had to step outside to vomit. Nilsen was arrested and driven to the police station. On the ride there, he was chatty, almost relieved. He began to confess before they even reached the interrogation room. He told them everything. He described the killings, the rituals, and the disposal. But there was a problem. Nilsen had killed so many people, and the victims were often transients without strong family ties, that he couldn't remember their names. He referred to them only by description: the Irishman, the Canadian, the boy with the Billy Idol hair. The investigation became a grim task of identifying the victims from the fragments found in the drains and the bones buried at his previous address. The police had to reconstruct the lives of men who had slipped through the cracks of society, men who had been missing for years without anyone officially looking for them. The trial in late 1983 captivated the British public. Nilsen pleaded not guilty to murder, arguing diminished responsibility. He claimed he blacked out during the killings and didn't mean to hurt anyone. But the prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating man who knew exactly what he was doing. The jury agreed. Dennis Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve at least 25 years. Nilsen spent the rest of his life in prison, becoming a prolific writer and jailhouse lawyer. He wrote an autobiography, painting himself as a misunderstood intellectual, a lonely man who loved too much. But the families of the victims saw only a narcissist who had treated their sons like disposable dolls. On May 12, 2018, Dennis Nilsen died in prison of natural causes at the age of 72. Number 10, Fred and Rose West. We conclude our journey into the heart of European darkness not with a solitary predator hiding in the shadows, but with a partnership. A marriage. In the quiet cathedral city of Gloucester, England, there stood a terraced house that looked like any other. Number 25 Cromwell Street was a large, somewhat dilapidated building, often filled with the noise of children playing and the comings and goings of lodgers. It was a chaotic, crowded home run by Fred West, a local builder with a gap-toothed smile and a friendly manner, and his wife, Rose, a stern woman with heavy glasses and a short temper. To the social workers and neighbors who visited, the Wests were a bit rough around the edges, perhaps a bit eccentric, but ultimately just a large, struggling family. But beneath the floorboards, behind the cellar walls, and buried deep in the garden soil, lay the remains of 12 young women and girls. Among them were their own children. Fred and Rose West were not just killers, they were a vortex of depravity who fed off each other's sadism, creating a domestic concentration camp where torture was a daily ritual and murder was a family secret. To understand how a house becomes a graveyard, we must look at the two damaged souls who built it. Frederick West was born in 1941 in Herefordshire. He was a man shaped by incest and abuse, with a charisma that masked a profound lack of empathy. He was a chameleon, able to charm vulnerable young women with offers of lifts or cheap accommodation. Rosemary Letts was just 15 years old when she met the 27-year-old Fred at a bus stop in 1969. She was a troubled girl from a broken home, looking for an escape. In Fred, she found a savior and a corrupter. He did not just groom her, he molded her. He introduced her to a world of sexual deviance, prostitution, and violence. But Rose was no reluctant victim. As the years went by, she evolved from the apprentice into the master. Psychologists would later argue that while Fred was the opportunist, Rose was the sadist, the driving force behind the most brutal acts committed in that house. The crimes of the West spanned 20 years, from 1967 to 1987. Their victims fell into three categories: their own children, the young women who came to lodge at Cromwell Street, and strangers snatched from bus stops. The house was a trap. Young women looking for a room to rent would be welcomed into the family. But soon, the atmosphere would shift. They would be drugged, bound, and subjected to unimaginable sexual torture in the cellar. The Wests used the noise of their own children and the loud renovations Fred was constantly doing to mask the screams. The most chilling aspect of the West case is the murder of their own family members. In 1971, while Fred was in prison for petty theft, Rose murdered Fred's stepdaughter, 8-year-old Charmaine. The little girl had become an annoyance to Rose. When Fred returned from prison, he didn't report the crime, he helped bury the body under the kitchen floor. Years later, their own biological daughter, Heather West, became the target. Heather was 16, bright, and beginning to rebel against the suffocating, abusive atmosphere of the house. She threatened to expose the family secrets. In June of 1987, Heather vanished. Fred and Rose told everyone she had run away to work in a holiday camp. They even joked to neighbors who asked about her, saying, "She's under the patio." It was a joke that hid a literal truth. Heather had been strangled and buried in the backyard, her grave leveled over with concrete by her own father. For years, the Wests operated with impunity. Police visited the house multiple times regarding truancy, petty crimes, and the runaway daughter, but the Wests were experts at manipulation. They played the system. They moved transient lodgers in and out so frequently that when a girl disappeared, no one noticed. They relied on the apathy of society towards young, drifting women. The unraveling of the House of Horrors began in 1992, not with a murder investigation, but with a conversation about incest. The West's surviving children, now older, began to speak to social workers about the sexual abuse they had suffered. The police began to look closer at the family. They reopened the file on the missing Heather West. Detectives became suspicious of Fred's evasive answers and the fact that no one had seen Heather since 1987. In February of 1994, armed with a search warrant, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street. They didn't know they were looking for bodies, they were just looking for evidence of Heather's fate. On February 24, 1994, police began to dig in the garden. Fred West, watching from the window, remained calm. But as the excavators broke through the concrete of the patio, they found a human femur. Then a skull. It was Heather. Confronted with the remains of his daughter, Fred tried to control the narrative. He confessed to killing Heather, claiming it was an accident during an argument. He tried to protect Rose, insisting she knew nothing. But the police didn't stop digging. Over the next few weeks, Cromwell Street became the center of the world's media. As forensics teams moved from the garden to the cellar, the body count rose. 3 bodies in the garden. 5 bodies in the cellar. Bodies under the bathroom. Bodies under the kitchen. The house was literally built on bones. In total, the remains of 9 young women were found at Cromwell Street. Fred also led police to a nearby field where he had buried his first wife, Rena, and her friend years earlier. He also confessed to the murder of his stepdaughter Charmaine at a previous address. The final tally was 12 confirmed victims, though Fred hinted at many more, claiming he had killed up to 30 people. The investigation revealed the full, nauseating extent of the partnership. Rose wasn't just a bystander, she was an active participant. Witness testimony from survivors and the West children described Rose as the one who often initiated the torture. She was the one who bought the tape to bind the victims. She was the one who jealously guarded her territory. The folie à deux, the shared madness, was complete. They were 2 halves of a perfect killing machine. But Fred West would never face a jury. On New Year's Day, 1995, while awaiting trial in Winson Green Prison, Fred West hanged himself in his cell. He left a suicide note that said nothing of remorse, only self-pity. He took the secrets of the other potential victims to the grave, robbing the families of closure. He was the coward to the end. This left Rose West to stand trial alone. In October of 1995, she entered the Winchester Crown Court. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her defense was simple: Fred did it all. She claimed she was a battered wife, a victim who knew nothing of the murders happening under her own roof. But the prosecution dismantled her lies. They presented evidence of her violent temper, the testimony of the children, and the sheer impossibility of living in a small house where extensive excavation and burial were taking place without noticing. The jury saw the cold, hard eyes of a woman who had murdered her own child to keep a secret. Rose West was found guilty on 10 counts of murder. The judge, Justice Mantell, looked at her and said, "If attention is paid to what I think, you will never be released." She was given a life sentence with a whole life order, making her one of the only women in British history destined to die in prison. The aftermath of the case was a final act of cleansing. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was a scar on the city of Gloucester. It attracted ghoulish tourists and vandals. In October of 1996, the city council demolished the house. Every brick, every piece of timber, and every ounce of rubble was crushed and secretly disposed of to prevent souvenir hunters from taking a piece of the horror. Today, a landscaped public footpath runs through the site. There is no plaque, no marker, no memory of the building. It is a non-place, an attempt to erase the physical existence of the evil that lived there. But the memory remains. Fred and Rose West shattered the illusion of the safe, suburban home. They proved that the most terrifying monsters don't live in caves or castles, they live in the terraced house down the street, waving at the neighbors while the cement dries in the cellar. Their crimes stand as the ultimate betrayal of family, of trust, and of humanity itself, marking the darkest point in the history of European crime.